We need all of the churches of the North Texas Annual Conference. Every one of them is important. Every one of them is a mission station that God can use to change the world. But there are some of our churches that have gotten into too much of a settler mentality. They've settled very, very well. I've not gone over your statistics, so I'm not going to talk about North Texas, but let me tell you about Kansas. Out of 694 churches in my area, 47% did not receive a single member by profession of faith in 2007. That means they didn't even have a confirmation class. Bruce Blake taught us that not only is every United Methodist an evangelist, but you measure how well you're doing by taking that profession of faith number and subtracting the confirmation number to find out how many adult Christians are hearing God's call and committing their lives to Christ and becoming disciples of Jesus Christ. Not only that, I've got churches in Kansas in growing counties. They're growing at a respectable 5% a year, so their numbers look good until you do the demographics and realize that their community grew 20% last year, so they're actually worse off than some churches that are stable in declining counties. This settler mentality is a problem. And yet, I also know churches that are so excited about the future that they've rejected the past and don't understand it. That's why another dichotomy to hold in tension with this both-and thinking might be described as traditional and contemporary. Now, most of us clergy, when we hear those categories, start thinking about the worship wars and what kind of music do we do and whether the preacher wears a robe and stole or shorts and a golf shirt or whatever. But I want to suggest that the traditions of the church can become a trap. That sometimes we become so traditional that we're not prepared to break out of new stuff. One church I'm aware of would not have a nursery with a paid nursery worker. Why? Because back in 1950, we kept all of our kids in church. Those young people can do it just like we did. You know what I told them? I said, my generation aren't nearly as good of parents as you all were. And I said, you have this choice. You can either hire a paid nursery worker or allow the young people in this town to go become Baptists. That finally got to them. It wasn't the mission of the church as much as competition with the Baptists. It sort of broke them out of their traditional mindset. And yet, I also know a church so contemporary that when they built their building, they ended up suing the Methodist banker and the Methodist architect because they weren't doing their construction process right. All the excitement meant they didn't have to pay attention to the rules and the processes. My friends, if we're going to talk about both and, we've got to respect the traditions of the church and build on them while at the same time going far back to the beginning traditions, because there was a time in your congregation when visionary people decided to plant a church in that location to evangelize the neighborhood and invite people to form new Sunday school classes. And if you can remember that part of the tradition, then being traditional is where being a pioneer meshes. Here's my challenge to all of you tonight. I hope each one of you ordinands figures out some way to honor the tradition of the church where you're going to serve. In my first appointment in this conference in Prosper, that meant asking Miss Essie Crockett at age 90 to sit up next to the pulpit and tell the story of how Ed, her husband, and his hired hand hauled every brick for that building up the hill from the railroad so that it could be built and worship take place. Honor the traditions. Honor the traditions that will lead you into the future. At the same time, I challenge you, start one new ministry this year. There's something you could do to reach somebody who's not being reached, to form some new group that will indeed help people get the pioneer spirit to break out of that tradition or to carry the best part of the tradition forward. Another both and thinking. I think God is calling us in the 21st century to be both high-tech and high-touch. Once again, there are people who are so high-touch that the only way they'll talk to somebody is if it's a face-to-face conversation, and they can't imagine doing anything digital. I also know people who are so digital that they don't ever go visit from house to house the way that people make a promise to when they're being ordained. They don't gather people into small groups. They don't mentor the small group leaders in other settings. I think the 21st century requires not either or, but both high tech and high touch. I spent my afternoon today in Bridwell Library. It's home for me, another place that I've spent a lot of time. A library building that's 50 years old. A library building that houses books 100 years old. But I took my laptop in, and instead of using a card catalog the way it used to be, I surfed on pony.com and did my bibliographical work on my laptop, organizing all the materials I needed to find the books that I needed. A perfect example of a traditional place serving the same function, but wirelessly helping people do it in new and different ways today. My father used a sermon illustration because he and Wes Seeliger were kindred spirits. The sermon illustration talks about Ken Stabler when he was a quarterback for the Oakland Raiders. Some of you young people think the Raiders are elsewhere and don't know the name of Ken Stabler, but back in the 70s, he was a powerful quarterback who was doing great stuff. But this sports writer got bored at the Raider training camp, and so he went out to the Jack London Museum and found this quote from Jack London on the wall. "I would rather be ashes than dust. I would rather that my spark should burn out in a brilliant blaze than that it should be stifled by dry rot. I would rather be a superb meteor, every atom of me in magnificent glow, than a sleepy and permanent planet. The proper function of humanity is to live, not to exist. I shall not waste my days in trying to prolong them. I shall use my time." So the sports writer copies all that down. He takes it to Stabler, reads it to him, says, "Stabler, what does this mean to you?" And Stabler says, "Throw deep." My father's ministry was at a time when he needed to break churches out of their settler mentality and encourage them to throw deep. But here's what I want to say to you. As a leader in God's church, you need to understand in a both-and sort of way that while throwing deep sounds wonderful, the only way you can throw deep is if you have recruited a first-class line of defenders, tackles, and guards to protect you while they're running. Recruited some really fast tight ends who can get downfield. Done the job of writing some really good plays. Practice hard and long together. And when you've got all that stuff together, then you can throw deep.